I have always been interested in the supernatural. I'm not exactly sure why, because every experience I have had, except for a few, I've gone out in search of. One of the most important aspects to my ghost hunting, if that's what you want to call it, is the scientific mindset. Everything that happens can be explained, and if it can't, supernatural causes are possible. One of the major things I like to do is to test extreme cases. One such thing is playing with Ouija boards in graveyards. Here's the ground rules to doing something such as this. 1. Don't go at the experiment alone, and be sure to bring someone that is 100% skeptical, as they will question everything that goes on. 2. Follow the process outline, so if the process says to read the words in this order, you do so to keep everything under control. And 3. Be prepared for all outcomes, natural and supernatural. It's safer this way for you. Here is what happened. A friend who really thinks ghosts, God, and everything supernatural is a load of crap. They are the kind of person who would argue it's all a bunch of tall tales. Perfect. I bought a Ouija board and researched a few things online about various different ways to amplify the experience, such as black candles and an interesting chant that was guaranteed to aggravate something from the world beyond. If this was going to be a success, I was going to push it to the extreme. After asking around and a bit of research, I was able to find a remote graveyard that was secluded from town and any surrounding areas that had high traffic. I came across a very small graveyard that was in the middle of the woods in a town about 30 minutes away. This spot was perfect because it would ensure no cops would bother us and no kids would try and screw with us and ruin the experiment. Now, when I tell you this graveyard was secluded, I'm not joking. This graveyard was scary as hell just by itself. To get to this graveyard, you have to drive 45 minutes, 30 minutes to the town, and then walk 15 minutes through a small trail that went through the woods. The trail was gravel and clearly hadn't been maintained in some time. The woods were thick and very dark, and even though my friend and I were there around 3 to 4 p.m, it was already dark as we walked. The trees that followed the trail to this graveyard were dead and dried up. Perfect, this couldn't be any better. When you approached the graveyard, you'd notice it was surrounded by an iron fence that was overrun with vines and weeds. The gravestones as well were covered. In the far right corner there was a tomb sealed and it had a name at the top. In the other corner was a shed, probably where the graveyard keeper had kept their things years ago when there was one. When we approached the gate, it took some force to open it since it hadn't been opened in a while. Rust was the only lock we had to deal with. When we got inside, we looked around to get a sense of the environment. Most of the gravestones were worn down, so reading them was very difficult. From one of the stones, we could see most of them were from the early to late 1800s. A few from the early 1900s. This clearly sounds like a made-up story already, right? I did a lot of research to find this place, so if it was anything less, it wouldn't have been worth it. After we looked around and got our bearings, we started to set everything up. We decided to set up at the foot of the steps of the tomb. I set the candles around the Ouija board and a few on the steps of the tomb. Everything was set, and we waited. When 6 p.m. rolled around, we got a sense of what true darkness was like. If you live in a city, you haven't a damn clue. True darkness is so dark that you can't even see your hand in front of your face. We decided to walk around asking the typical questions that you see ghost hunters do on TV with a tape recorder. We took photos and recorded footage for about 3 hours. We took about a 2-hour break to eat and prepare for the Ouija board experiment. Up until now, everything had been quiet, bone-chillingly quiet. I was having fun because it was so interesting being in such a spooky place, but honestly the experience seemed to start losing its unique touch, until we sat down at the foot of the tomb. At this point the temperature had gotten colder, causing a fog to start to form around the graveyard. As we sat down, we lit all the candles I had set up and turned off the flashlights. We were only illuminated by the candle lights, and luckily we could still see the board. It was now 3 a.m. and we started the ritual, if you want to call it that. We made the 3 circles with the planchette. I read off the chant I had found and we started to ask questions. Is anyone there? Nothing. Does anything want to communicate? Nothing. My friend laughs. Maybe they are bored to death. I can't blame them, I laughed. Do you have a name? After asking this question, there was a knock on the door behind us. The door to the tomb was wooden. Not sure how it held up for so long, but we clearly heard something that sounded like a knock coming from the door of the tomb. We shrugged it off and proceeded with the questions. It was probably just a rock or something falling down. It was old. We asked another question. We stopped and turned. 1 time is luck, twice is coincidence. Now remember, we had been out here for some time. We have patrolled the graveyard and there is no way someone could have gotten inside the tomb without us knowing or noticing. We continued with the Ouija board and just for shits and giggles I decided to ask, "Are you trapped in the tomb?" Knock once for yes and 2 for no. We waited. Not for very long, but we hung on to every second as we listened. This sent chills down my back. Even now as I write this, I can feel those same goosebumps on the back of my neck and up and down my arms. This sound was happening deliberately. "Okay, that's interesting," stated my friend. "Yeah, no kidding," I replied. "Are you human?" I asked out loud. We abandoned the Ouija board and walked closer to the door. Now I would like to point out, we did not follow proper procedure in closing the connection when we walked away from the board. As we got closer to the door, there came this very heavy, as if someone slammed against the door. Taken aback, we kept our distance from the door. I'm not sure if it was stupidity or the fact we weren't alone that gave us courage to stay, but we kept asking questions. After about 30 minutes of asking questions, everything went quiet. No more knocking. No more scratches or low growls. Just dead silence. The air became very heavy and my ears started to ring due to lack of sound. It was as if everything was covered in a blanket of darkness. My friend and I froze. That was intense. I've never believed in this shit, but that was certainly creepy, he said. Yeah, I replied, not sure what really to say. As we turned to go, we noticed all the candles were out except for one. The candle closest to the Ouija board stayed illuminated. As we approached, we noticed the planchette had moved. I remember we had left it in the middle of the board because we weren't getting anything. It had moved from the center of the board and was now pointing at the letter D. I don't know about you, but this seemed to drape me in fear. In this setting, nothing good starts with D. Demon, devil, die, death, damnation. For some reason, this was the breaking point for us. We left very quickly and walked speedily back to our car. I don't remember much of that walk, other than the overwhelming fear that someone or something was following us. When we got home, we listened to the voice recordings. Most of them were static and just us asking questions, until we got near the end when we pulled the board out. For the first few minutes you hear us talking, getting prepared, then me doing the chant, and then we heard it. In the background you could hear, as clear as day, something laughing. While we were there we didn't hear anything. We didn't see anyone, but here was this laughing, as clear as day. As we proceed to listen, we hear growling, loud scraping like noises. Then we started to watch the video we had taken. This is where things got very weird. First you see us walking about with the flashlight. Nothing out of the ordinary. Every time we passed over the tomb there seemed to be a pair of eyes. First it would be peering out of the crack in the door. Another would be looking out of the windows. They seemed to be following us as we walked around. Either we brought something sinister into this world, or someone had trapped it inside that tomb. I just hope we didn't set it free by using the board. This happened whilst I was at work last year, 2017. I work at a haunted house for the month of October, and I have done every year for almost 5 years. I'm a contortionist and actress, so I've always been working in the exorcism and asylum parts of the house. You know, backbends, weird spider crawling, the works. Being a scare actress is bad enough as it is, as you're always going to get that one asshole who becomes physical, punching or lashing out at you for some reason. It's not uncommon to go home with a few cuts and bruises after a good night of scaring people, but the rules state that they can't touch us and we can't touch them. The night it happened, I got to work around 5 p.m, already in full costume and makeup, and I signed in at what we actors love to call the slaughterhouse. It's basically a mess hall where actors and customers can eat and chill before walking through or going in for their shifts. After I signed in and got compliments off my outfit from other scare actors, I walked to the butcher house out the back. The butcher house is the costume and makeup shed where actors and press hang out to get promotional photos and get ready to be transported out to their sections for the night. I was really early that night, so I spent a while there. I was milling around and talking with some of the people who had trained me when I first started. They were these football players from the local high school who had their own section of the trail. They were known as the clown crew. I knew every single clown mask, costume, and actor in that group, and they are all great guys, but damn am I terrified of clowns, so they never failed to scare me every day before my shift. That being said, they're all gentle giants, and 2 of them, Ethan and Ben, look out for me on the trail. I am a little 5'8" girl, and in this profession things out on the trail can get pretty messy pretty quick if it gets out of hand. Luckily though, Ethan and Ben are always there to take care of me. Around 6:30 the loudspeakers told us to go to our supervisors for transport. My supervisor's name was Gail, and she drove me down the forest trail that night with the clown crew. Ethan and Ben get assigned near me for the night, like always, and the scaring started. The great thing about this haunted trail was that it was a hiking trail from a sportsman's club, so the entire thing took place out in the woods with only a trance of lights on either side of the path to lead the way. So naturally, it was dark and perfect for the asylum portion where we worked. Everything was going great and was running pretty smoothly until it hit around 11:30. This is what all of us actors call the hell hour. It's around these times in our shifts where it never hurts to watch out for drunks walking through. You never know how they'll respond, but usually it's never good. So we all had our guard up as we got into position for the next group. Ben and Ethan put on their clown masks and straitjackets and went up the trail to these little blind spots so they could jump out and scare the next group of people. I was the leader of this section that night, which was pretty cool. As I was in the asylum portion, I had an old white dress covered in bloodstains and some pretty grotesque-looking makeup. I was the best contortionist they had, and I ended up getting promoted. I stretched and got ready to do my exorcism backbend, but that's when I saw the next group. It wasn't a group. It was just one guy, and he smelled distinctly of beer and body spray. I could barely see in the dark that he had a huge forearm tattoo peeking out under his long sleeve. I felt like he was a huge red flag for me. Not only was he alone, but he smelled of alcohol. I decided to do a quick scare and get him out of my section as quick as possible, but he had stopped at the entrance to my portion and was staring at me from where I stood on the trail. I wanted to keep as much distance as possible, so I backed up to the edge of the hiking trail to give him a lot of space to walk past me. I did something small, screaming and twitching, but not taking my eyes off him for a second. I decided to finally do my backbend, and that's when it all went wrong. This guy lunged forward and grabbed me off balance. He grabbed me by the hem of my dress and yanked it up, exposing my stomach and spandex shorts to the cold air. I screamed in shock and turned my head to yell for Ethan and Ben, but he put a hand over my mouth and started grabbing my shorts. I bit his hand and he slammed his forearm into my throat, which not only hurt like hell but had so much force packed behind it that he knocked me off the small trail I was standing on and down a 5-foot drop into the pitch-black trees below. Then the coward took off. I was in a lot of pain and couldn't scream for help. I just laid there in shock, my dress completely shredded from where he'd grabbed it. I couldn't really move until what I could only assume was 10 minutes later, when I finally managed to crawl up the small embankment and lay down painfully on the part of the trail that was lit up. I started crying. Ethan and Ben were there in an instant, covering me in a blanket and holding me. Security had shown up with searchlights trying to find me, and a bunch of actors from the entire trail just stood by in complete shock as I laid there sobbing my eyes out. They pulled me off the trail with all the other actors and shut down the trail for the night. They took an ID of the guy I described and tried to track him down before he could run off, but no one reported him exiting the trail, and he didn't leave through the ordinary exit because he wasn't on the camera feed. He just disappeared. The first aid team washed all of my fake blood and makeup off and gave me some ice for a small cut on my head where I apparently cracked it on a tree as I fell down. I found a lot more cuts after showering later that night. Fake blood dirt had covered a lot of them. Ben and Ethan stayed with me and offered to drive me home since they carpooled, but I assured them I could drive myself, especially since I couldn't leave my car there or I wouldn't be able to get back tomorrow. That's when I got my bag and coat and walked out to the now mostly deserted employee parking lot, completely exhausted from the night. And that's when I saw him. A guy in a rubber clown mask was standing at the edge of the parking lot against the woods. Normally this wouldn't freak me out because I work at a haunted trail. Everyone tries to scare each other. But I knew every clown mask from the costume shed. I've taken inventory countless times, counting and recounting our clown crew costumes, and that wasn't one of their masks. This one had bright blue hair and dark blood all around the mouth and neck, but the worst part was the eyes. They were completely black and elongated to look like it was grinning angrily. I knew I didn't recognize this mask. This guy wasn't even a huge football player like the actors in the clown crew. He was skinny and wearing black jeans and a jacket. Something was very wrong, especially since he was staring right at me. I didn't stop when I saw him, but I realized really quickly that we were both about 100 feet from my car and the driver's door was facing him. I pulled out my keys and really tried to make it look like I didn't see him walking pretty fast towards my car, hoping I wasn't the one he was coming after. But when I was about 10 feet from my car, the clown bolted towards me at a dead sprint. I never ran so fast in my life. I unlocked my door, climbed in, slammed it shut, and locked it so fast I thought I would get whiplash. I also had to turn on my car and roll the window up. I had left it halfway rolled down and he was sprinting right towards me. I had just about rolled it up when the clown guy slammed into the side of my driver's door, struggling to pull open the locked door. He kept slapping his hand on the closing window, and that's when I smelled that smell. Beer and body spray. I have not a doubt in my mind that this was the same guy who had tried grabbing me on the trail. I didn't even hesitate. I just threw my car into reverse and flew out of the parking lot as fast as I could. He only chased my car for a few seconds before he stopped and turned, bolting off into the woods. I pulled over 5 minutes later to cry and call Ben and Ethan. They pulled up next to me 10 minutes later and Ben drove me home in my car with Ethan following after. Ever since then I carpooled to work with those two and they never let me walk alone after our shift again. About 2 weeks later, on my last shift of the season, I was doing inventory in the butcher house as I always do, but I found the mask, the blue-haired, black-eyed clown mask. It was just sitting on the rack. I asked around, but no one had any record of purchase for it. It was as if it had just shown up. It still smelled like beer and body spray. Ever since I was a kid, my sister Jazz and I were never allowed in the basement. Our mother died when I was born, and my father had dumped us at my grandma's house, so we've lived there all our life. We never questioned why we weren't allowed, we just agreed that it wasn't a good idea. One day, my little sister came up to my room and walked in. I was playing on my Xbox when she asked me why we weren't allowed in the basement. I paused my game and looked at her. I had never really thought about it before. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe Granny just doesn't want us down there." My sister folded her arms and pouted. "But why? I want to look and see," she exclaimed. I put down my controller. "It's just Granny's rule. We should respect that," I said, trying to sound like a smart older brother. Jazz looked at me with big green eyes as if she were about to cry. "Please, Zach, I won't ask again, promise," she cried. I let out a huge sigh. "All right, just this once, I'll take you down there," I said, as I got up and grabbed my sister's little hand and led her down the stairs. Granny was asleep, so this would be the perfect time to look. We approached the back of the house where the basement door was located. I reached my hand to the doorknob. Something felt strange, as if I shouldn't open it. I shook off the feeling and twisted the old handle. The door swung open. There was no light whatsoever, just darkness. "There, now you can see. Happy now?" I asked. Jazz stomped her feet in anger. "No, I want to go in," she protested. I felt a sickening feeling in my stomach. I complied and took a step down. My sister went before me and skipped down the stairs. I was scared to leave her on her own, so I quickly followed after her. We reached the end of the 13 steps, and my bare feet touched the cold stone floor. It was dirty and dusty. I felt around the walls, feeling for a light switch. I felt a button and pressed it. One light switched on in the center of the empty room. "Ooh, pretty," my sister danced over, wearing a pearl necklace. "Maybe you shouldn't be wearing that," I exclaimed, attempting to grab it. She ran off into the darkness. "Jazz?" I called. "Where did you go, you little monkey?" I peered around, looking for her. There was silence. Then there was noise from behind me, coming from the door. I looked up. It was my sister. "Zach, I was looking for you. I wanted you to fix my dollhouse. Why are you in the basement? Granny always has it locked." I gulped. A feeling of dread washed over me. I started to shake a little. I instantly ran up the stairs, not looking back. Since that day, I have never been in the basement. I'm not sure why the basement was unlocked or what that thing was pretending to be my sister. All I know is that I'm happy I got out of there before it got any worse. I'm 15 now, and that was 6 years ago. I have never told Granny about what happened, and I'm not going to, just in case she has a panic attack or something. Update. I haven't posted anything on here in a year, because nothing really happened since then. Until now. As I previously stated, I never told my granny about the incident. However, recently I did get in touch with my father. Yes, he dumped me with his mother and I barely ever see him since my mum died, but I had to talk about it. You see, recently, the image of what I saw in the basement all those years ago has been plaguing my mind. I could have sworn I'd imagined the whole thing, but when I asked my sister, she confirmed that I was indeed in the basement that day. Then, whilst rereading my post, it hit me. My sister doesn't have green eyes. They're brown. They've always been brown. I quote, "Jazz looked at me with big green eyes as if she was about to cry." This realization sent shivers down my spine and made my head spin. After this, I couldn't contain my worry anymore. I ran into the kitchen and rapidly searched the drawers for my granny's phone book. She'd have my dad's number. After a while, I found it. I tried to call, but no answer. So I tried to call him again. This time I left a voice message. "Pick up, it's about..." I gulped. "The basement." You see, Granny had always had the same rule for everyone. No one in the basement. I knew my dad would know about this. He immediately picked up, and so I told him my story. To my surprise, he was no stranger to the incident. He told me when he was a young boy that he one day found the door unlocked and let his adventurous side loose. He told me there he met a little girl with big green eyes. She was playing with jewelry and running around in joy. My dad asked what her name was, but she just kept running further and further into the darkness. Eventually my dad got bored and tried to leave, but something grabbed him. He tried desperately to break loose and in the end resulted to yelling. The thing let go. My dad then ran up the stairs and told his mother about what happened. She locked the door and told him, Sometimes she gets restless, don't mind her. That raised some serious alarm bells. My dad told me he did some digging and supposedly the girl down there died in a fire at this location. A new house was built on the remains of the previous house, and her spirit remains in the older part of the house. I am very skeptical of this whole story, but it does bring some light to this. The only question I still have is what my granny's connection is to all this. Should I ask? I don't want to worry her, but she has some answers I need. This happened around 1991 when I would have been almost 16. At that time, my bedroom was down in the basement of my family's townhouse. One day, my sister came home sometime in the late afternoon and called down to my room asking why the back door was open. The townhouse we lived in had a very small backyard. It was more of a courtyard. With London being smack dab in the middle of a snow belt, it was largely useless from November to April, as it was generally filled with 4 or 5 feet of snow. So for the back door to be open in the middle of winter was highly unusual. I came upstairs and we both looked out into the failing light of the backyard. Packed with snow, untouched by feet, the screen door was still closed and locked, but the door was definitely open. We were stumped. As we formulated theories on how the door might have popped open, we heard footsteps walking around upstairs. My sister had just gotten home, but I had been there all day. I knew nobody should be upstairs. Go down to the basement, I told her, and grabbed the cordless phone to call my parents as I followed her down. It took a minute to get my mother on the line. She sounded a little tipsy. I explained the situation and urged them to come home right away. She said she would be home soon. I remember saying we might be dead by then. While I was getting off the phone, we could hear the footsteps now working their way down to the main level where we had just been. They seemed to be approaching the stairs down to the basement. "Hide behind the dryer and don't come out no matter what you hear," I told my sister. The basement had a furnished front area and a separate unfurnished back where the washer and dryer were. She ran back while I stood behind my bed watching the bottom of the stairs. Around this point in my life, I had been practicing throwing steak knives at a dartboard on my bedroom wall. I was no expert, but I had gotten pretty good at it by that point. 8 out of 10 hit the dartboard and they stayed in. I figured an intruder would think twice about doing anything if I started laying into him with steak knives as soon as he showed his face at the bottom of the stairs. I had almost 10 knives right next to my bed. I clutched them in my hands, one ready to fly. As I listened to the footsteps begin down the stairs into the basement, I remember being strangely calm. I waited, listened to the footsteps, knowing whoever it was would soon be showing. The basement stairs were especially loud. Then, silence. Whoever it was seemed to have stopped on the stairs, just outside my line of sight. This was much more maddening than expecting an intruder to step into the basement. I could only assume he thought it was too quiet and he was trying to gauge the situation. I waited. I waited what seemed like 15 minutes. It was probably more like 1. Eventually I crept slowly around my bed and began to walk slowly, step by step, sideways to try to see around the staircase. It was empty. Nobody was there. It was impossible to think anyone could make that much noise walking through the house and then just disappear silently. I was in shock. My sister and I searched the house after, both armed with steak knives. Nothing. My parents came home hours later, their usual time, having forgotten about the whole thing. Needless to say, they hate me bringing up this story since they come across so negligent. There were a few other weird things that happened in that house, but this one stands out the most to me. I was listening to creepy high school stories on YouTube today which had me recall something that happened to me. Back in 2002, I lived in Australia and attended the local college. Students were required to take a few technology classes, and one of my classes was metalwork. Our teacher, whom I'll refer to as Mr. Muzz, was a short, skinny man who was probably in his mid to late 40s had wispy grey hair and just seemed to generally hate teenagers. Our school uniform, I swear, must have been designed by a Class A pervert due to the fact that the summer dresses we had would go completely see-through if gotten wet, and unless you altered your school skirt or kilt yourself, it would always turn into a miniskirt when you sat down. Mr. Muzz truly hated the kids in his class. He would scream at us and throw us out of the classroom for minor discretions or disorder. But worst of all, he was the biggest pervert ever. He would deliberately walk behind all of us girls, drop his pencil on the floor, so when he had to bend down to pick it up, he would be able to gaze up our skirts and dresses. He frequently told us that it was unladylike to wear boxers under our skirts, which was the in thing to do at our school at the time. It was the early 2000s after all. One day my friend was getting sick of his behaviour and wrote pervert in bold letters across the front and back of her thigh and encouraged us to do the same. A few of us did it. During the metalwork class that day, my friend happily smiled as she stood at her workbench knowing that Mr. Muzz was making his pencil rounds. When he got to her and dropped his pencil, his face contorted into a snarl. He grabbed her arm and loudly asked, "Why have you written on your legs?" She yanked her arm back and screamed at the top of her voice, "Why are you looking up our skirts, you sick fucking pervert?" Mr. Muzz's face was a mask of fear as he knew that we all now had proof of what he was up to. We went straight to our principal afterwards and explained what had happened, but sadly nothing was really done about it besides Mr. Muzz getting a formal warning. The following term all the girls obviously dropped from his class, resulting in him giving us all death stares whenever he saw us.